Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We have a lot of great data to share with you from Bill Pollock, who's the President and Principal Consulting Analyst at Strategies for Growth. I'm going to give folks a few more minutes to get dialed in, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we have a few more folks who've joined. So again, thank you so much for taking time today to participate in our webinar featuring Strategies for Growth. My name is Emily Hackman. I'm the Director of Global Marketing here at Astea International. And our featured speaker today is Bill Pollock, who's the President and Principal Consulting Analyst at Strategies for Growth. If you've been in the field service industry, you know that he is a renowned speaker and author. I guarantee you've read some of his articles or seen him speak at some of the field service conferences around the globe. We're very pleased to have Bill with us today. He has a lot of great data to share with you from his analyst take paper on how the best practices field service organizations are achieving and maintaining their status. Some quick agenda for today. We're going to do an overview analysis and some of the key takeaways of the survey findings from this analyst report that Bill put together. That will include the top 6 do's and don'ts of the best practice FSOs or field service organizations. At the end, I'll give you a really brief introduction to Astea's latest field service management platform, Alliance Enterprise, that we formally launched to the market this morning. And then we'll be followed by Q&A. If you do have any questions for either Bill or myself throughout the course of the webinar, feel free to type them into the little Q&A section, and we'll try to answer as many of them live at the end of the presentation as possible. And now, without further ado, I want to turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for that introduction. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. We've got a lot of material to cover, and what I wanted to do is say this before we get started. The webinar is just part of a package that Astea is going to be hosting for us. There will also be an infographic. There's a companion analyst take white paper and other materials. So you can take notes, but if you miss something, you can always download some of the other materials, and they will probably answer most of your questions. So basically what we want to talk about today is what's the difference between best practices FSOs, or field service organizations. How do they operate differently in order to achieve and then maintain their best-in-class status? So what makes them different from all others, and how do they get there in the first place, and how do you get there? So what I wanted to talk about now is before we get started on sharing the survey results, I always like to let the audience know where the results came from. So our 2017 Field Service Management Benchmark Survey had a total of 419 respondents, of which just over 10% were best practices respondents. Now, we define, for the purposes of this report, best practices as those FSOs that are achieving a 90% or greater customer satisfaction rating during the year, plus 30% or greater service profit margin. So the logic behind that is if they're attaining the customer satisfaction and they're still making a profit doing it, they most likely have the best processes in place in order to achieve those goals. And what we'll see through the survey data is the evidence that, yes, in fact, they do have all of those tools in place. And why don't we get started on some of the data? The first place I normally like to look at is the FSO managing service as a profit center or as a cost center? And when we started doing these surveys, we've done 5 of them over the past 8 years. And before we started doing it, and then during the first 1 or 2 surveys, we typically got about 62, 63, 64% that were operating as a profit center. From the best practices perspective, we have 74% running service with its own individual P&L, plus another 10% of 100% service companies. They don't manufacture anything, but they still provide service to their customers. So that adds up to 84%. This is the highest we've received from the best practices standpoint. Plus, it's significantly higher than what we get from the overall survey results. For example, 70% was the percentage operating service as a profit center among the total survey results, 84% for best practices. That's 20% more. And we'll see that this is important because it helps the organization in setting its goals, developing the metrics to make sure that it's meeting its goals, targets, and directives for the course of the year and beyond. And it really sets them apart from those that are still running as cost centers. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we move through the presentation. What we also wanted to show is that there's been an uptick in the percentage of users, whether they're best in class or best practices or all others, in terms of using an off-the-shelf field service management solution. Right now, what we see is 49%, almost half, are using an off-the-shelf solution with just some minor customization. We're not talking about months and months and months of customization. We're talking about things that would make the off-the-shelf solution more amenable and more complementary to the unique situation that the service organization is in with respect to its product lines and coverage, its geographic coverage, and other factors that make that particular service organization different from its competitors. What we also see, though, is that there are another 5% that use a solution off the shelf with no customization. So that 54% is this is the first year where, whether it's for best practices organizations or the total survey base, that number has gone above 50%, which really shows the strength of the cloud-based solutions that are being offered today, where you can get something off the shelf and it does just about everything that you need. Still, there are 5% that are basically using a series of manual processes to run their field service operations. Now, that 5%, anything greater than 0%, is somewhat alarming to me. But the numbers here for best practices at 5% are about 1/3 to 1/4 the percents that we see for all others, which range from 12 to 18%, even higher in some individual vertical segments. So there still are even some best practices organizations that are using Excel spreadsheets and Post-it notes and things like that. Their day will come when they just get to a point where that's not going to work anymore. This 5%, particularly among the best practices organization, is likely to dwindle down to nothing or next to nothing within the next couple of years. Now, regardless of what kind of system or processes they're using, there isn't exactly a love affair going on with the best practices organizations and their primary field service management solution vendor. For example, we see that 61% are presently satisfied with their primary vendor. The only thing is, of that 61%, almost half, 29%, while they're satisfied, they're still thinking of upgrading. And upgrading could possibly mean upgrading to a newer release or a newer version of what they're currently using. But it could also mean migrating to another system or switching vendors altogether and going a different way. There's some cases where moving from an on-premise scenario to a cloud scenario would fall within the category of we're satisfied with what we have, but we're thinking of upgrading. It's time to go beyond on-premise. We want to go into the cloud. So the mirror image of that, or the converse, is that 38%, whether they're satisfied or not satisfied, is almost irrelevant. They're still thinking of upgrading and switching. 9% are not satisfied. They're actively looking for a new vendor. So what this shows to me, this slide and the one before it, is it's a very much complacent market among the best practices organizations. We see similar patterns among all other organizations, which would include industry average, perhaps an organization like one of yours, but it's more pronounced among the best practices. Basically, they want to continually raise the bar for what they need, and they want their vendors to continually meet that raised bar. And if they're not going to meet it, whether they're satisfied or not at that point, they're still considering moving on. So what we wanted to take a look at now is what's actually driving the market, particularly among the best practices FSOs today. And this week, I believe, is the 10th anniversary of the stock market crash and economic downturn of 10 years ago. And if we were to present these data about principal drivers and expectations and challenges and benefits, et cetera, and so forth, 10 years ago or 15 years ago from today, what we would have seen is the number one factor, number one and number two, would probably focus on the customer. And then the next couple of factors would focus on processes and efficiencies. And then the fifth factor on this chart would focus on most likely cost reduction. But it's a different world today, although it is returning back to some sense of normalcy. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean. So when we ask the question, which of the following represent one of your top three principal drivers that influences the way you conduct your business? 53%, the only one over 50%, say the need to improve workforce utilization and productivity. And then when we look at the need to improve service process efficiencies at 42%, we're seeing that two of the top three line items here focus on productivity and efficiencies and processes. So that's somewhat of a return to the normalcy that we had seen in previous years, but not a full return necessarily. What we are seeing, though, is that customer demand for quicker response time and customer demand for improved asset availability are rated at 42% and 37%, saying they're among the top three drivers. So we're seeing a bubbling up because in the past year's survey and the year before that, the percentages for customer demand-related drivers were not quite as high. In fact, what really took precedent over the past 10 years is for the first 5 or 6 years or so, the need to cut costs, reduce costs, or cost containment was typically the number one or number two driver. And then over the last 4 or 5 years, that's been replaced by the mandate to drive increased service revenues. In other words, when you look at the bottom line, you can improve your bottom line by reducing your costs. That would reduce the denominator. But you can also improve your bottom line by increasing the numerator, which is increasing service revenues. And most organizations, and I'm sure that many of you will agree, really can't cut costs any more than you've done over the past 10 years. You're at a threshold now. So the next best thing, and I would argue the best thing to have begun doing 10 years ago anyway, would be to focus more on increasing service revenues rather than on cutting costs. So we see a picture here that's not quite back to the way things used to be, but nothing is going to be quite back to the way things used to be. But there is a sense of normalcy returning here, and I would venture to say in the next year or two, the customer demand-related drivers are going to rise back up to number one and number two like they've been historically for decades. There are other key drivers that you need to focus on as well, and I'll give this to you as an example. When you look at this second set of 5 factors, most research organizations will only show you the first chart. These are the ones you need to focus on. And admittedly, they are the ones you probably need to focus on the most. However, if nearly a quarter, 23%, are saying that competitive pressures and the need for differentiation are among the top 3 drivers that make them go into work and make changes, make things happen, then you need to address those factors as well. So we always like to go the extra mile, show the extra chart, and say that here's what's also important to some of your customers, and something as high as 23% or 1 out of 6, 16%, looking for more accurate service call scheduling, you need to focus on those too, not just the first tier line items that you saw on the previous chart. Now, what we wanted to do also is to take a look at, we know what the drivers are now. What challenges do these drivers represent? How do you get to where you're driving to? What challenges are you going to meet? And the flip on that is what is the benefit of addressing those challenges head on and succeeding while you're moving forward. So the top challenge is relating to the acquisition of new field service management solution technology, generally related to the cost of the new technology. So the number one factor here, almost cited by half of the respondents among best practices organizations, is the ROI. What return are we going to get on our investment for new technology? But when you look at the other factors here, the other challenges, we look at a couple other cost factors. The cost of new technology is one of them, and but the number 2, 3, and 4 factors here are all clustered together between a quarter and a third of respondents. Basically, they're saying our challenge is how do we integrate the new technologies into our existing field service management solution? And how do we select the most effective solution? And how can we be sure that we're identifying all of the required functionality and then getting the solution that provides that required functionality? So those top 5 factors really go into a hodgepodge of challenges that need to be met in order for you as a services manager to be able to go to your senior management and say, hey, look, we need this new technology. Here's the return we're going to get on it. And we're certain now that we've chosen the right solution. Here's what it's going to cost, and we need your buy-in so we can go and acquire this technology. So, in other words, the first line item on this chart, the ROI, is the most important. But the next 4 or 5 items all go together hand in hand with that anticipated ROI into a package that you can give, whether it's your elevator speech or your half-hour presentation or your 2-day management sessions, where you're basically presenting the argument to your management that we need the new technology because of this. Here's what we're doing to make sure we're getting the right technology, and here's the return we're going to get out of it. Now, it's not that simple, but some of the other charts that we show are going to prove the case a little bit more. And, for example, the next one talks about, well, we know what the challenges are. If we meet those challenges, what opportunities or benefits are we going to gain from the acquisition of the new technology? So right off the bat, the 2 things that stand out is the ability to provide an end-to-end customer engagement relationship. So end-to-end engagement relationship, to me, means a little bit more than just customer relationship management. You can manage your relationship with your customers without providing them with an end-to-end solution. That's not going to do justice to the solution. It's not going to do justice to what the customer expects and is going to need to run its service operations. So the ability to provide an end-to-end engagement relationship is number 1, but it's also tied with the opportunity to improve customer satisfaction. So again, when I said these go hand in hand, if you can provide your customers with an end-to-end engagement, you're most likely going to improve their satisfaction with you as a provider. So you can't do one without the other. Which is the chicken, which is the egg is irrelevant. You need the chicken and you need the egg. But some organizations are also looking at the ability to establish a competitive advantage as one of the top opportunities or benefits that comes through the acquisition of this new FSM technology. So what that means is to establish a competitive advantage is not something that's cut and dried. It's not a static measurement. It's more dynamic. For example, if you can leapfrog ahead of your competitors because you've got better technology, better service delivery processes, better procedures to run your service operations, then that will give you a competitive advantage. But as you're doing that, your competitors are probably doing something too. So it's going to be a constant battle of catching up in some cases, surpassing in other cases, leapfrogging in other cases. But these are the abilities that you get, the opportunities or benefits that you get from integrating new technology into your field service management solution. There are other advantages too, other opportunities. You can run a more efficient field service operation. You can eliminate the silos. You can move from a more decentralized operation to a more centralized operation. You can coordinate more between service and sales, service and manufacturing, service and product development. And that's a key opportunity here that's cited by a third of the respondents as one of the top three benefits or opportunities that come from acquiring new technology. And of course, improving field tech utilization and productivity, a quarter of them say, yeah, that's also going to come from this. But what this is saying is, I would interpret this as being the 23% is really a little bit more than that. And the reason is that by doing that, that will help you to provide more of an end-to-end engagement with your customers. So, that's part and parcel of the first couple of factors here. You do that improvement of field tech utilization and productivity. You run a more efficient shop, and that's absolutely going to positively impact your ability to provide an end-to-end engagement relationship, improve your customer satisfaction, and have you not only keep up with your competition, but surpass your competition in many cases. So to put some things in perspective, what we wanted to take a look at here is what current strategic actions are best practices organizations taking today? What are they doing that everybody should be doing, but they might be doing a little bit more of it. Now, I'll show you what I mean. Whenever we show this kind of chart, basically, when we're looking at the total survey results, not just best practices, but all respondents, we see some of these factors jumping above the 50% line. For best practices organizations, if you're a little surprised that not even half say that one of the current strategic actions is to develop or improve the KPIs that they use to measure their field service performance, well, don't be surprised. And the reason is they did it last year. They did it the year before. They did it 5 years ago. So whether it's developing or improving the metrics they use, investing in mobile tools, automating existing manual processes, increasing customer involvement through customer portals in the web-based service process, integrating new technologies. It doesn't matter what the strategic action is. Many best practices organizations have already done this. So rather than looking at the percentages and saying 47%, 44, 35, they don't seem all that high. Well, they're very high for organizations that have already accomplished much of this, but they're still taking actions to improve their metrics. They're still investing in mobile tools. They're still automating more of the manual processes and integrating more processes. So if the numbers were a little off-putting at first, they shouldn't have been. And really, it does reflect the fact that best practices organizations have already gotten off the mark and have started taking these actions. So when we look at the planned strategic actions over the next 12 months among the best practices organizations, it would be very easy to say, well, if they've done it over the past couple of years and they're doing it this year, they're probably not planning to do it again next year. But that's not the case. We see numbers almost as high, but a little flip-flopping of some of the ordering of the strategic actions. We see not quite half, but 44% saying, you know what, we've already kind of taken care of developing our metrics. We've made a number of investments. We've hired additional field service technicians and dispatchers. We're outsourcing some or all of our field service activities to partners or vendors, but we still need to improve our planning and forecasting with respect to field operations. Improved planning and forecasting, I don't think anyone would argue, would reduce future costs because you'd be carrying less inventory, you'd be forecasting customer demand and being ready for it and not wasting resources along the way. and the converse of that being not being ready to support your customers when they have a need because you haven't planned enough resources. So what we're seeing over the next 12 months is the continuation of strategic actions, whether they've done it 2 to 5 years before, or even 6 to 10 years before, or just last year. They're still going to be doing it this year. And if we were to do this data cut for best practices organizations in our 2018 surveys, we're likely to see similar results. The continuum goes on. Best practices organizations in particular keep things moving. They don't stop. They don't say, well, we've already done everything we need to do in terms of integrating new technologies. We can stop now. There's no stopping among the best practices organizations. So what makes the best practices organizations best practices? And that's not only taking these actions, but sharing the results of those actions with the field technicians primarily, but also with their customers. So basically what we're seeing here is, on this chart, the online capabilities that are currently being provided to field technicians. So what we see right off the bat is some high numbers here. And these aren't what are the top 3 capabilities. These are what capabilities are you currently providing, period. So we're looking at this, the ability to track and update the current status of work orders, ability to initiate service orders, access to customer and or asset service history. 3/4 or more of the best practices organizations are already doing that. But they're not only doing that. We see a high majority, more than 60%, they're also using their capabilities to support their field techs with the ability to schedule people and equipment, access to schematics and documentation, access to real-time parts inventory and availability. And the list goes on and on. On the next chart, we see another 4 capabilities that are currently being provided to field techs by best practices FSOs. Looking at last year's numbers, we don't see as many of these capabilities being offered. The numbers are lower. The numbers at 50% or higher are lower. And so we're seeing some great improvement here. Every year when we do the survey, there are more and more capabilities being provided to field technicians. So the sharing of the capabilities, sharing of the data, sharing of access to data to the field techs is important. It's been recognized as important, and that's what we've been seeing growing at really quite a fast pace over the past couple or few years. There are even more capabilities being planned. And, rather than reading each one of these in particular, you can see that some of them have not been among those that a majority are presently offering. So we're seeing some new capabilities being added to the portfolio, and over time, year after year after year, we'll see even more being added. But when we look at what's being provided to customers as well, we're seeing a similar but somewhat dampened picture compared to what's presently being offered to field techs. For example, there are no 79 or 77% here. In fact, there are only 3 or 4 that are at or just about at the 50 percentile level, and that's the ability to view current status of work order, ability to order parts, ability to update status of work order, and ability to initiate or create service tickets online. So again, what we're seeing here is, I guess the best analogy would be if you're on a plane taking a flight somewhere and there's a sudden depressurization, the flight attendant will tell you, put the oxygen mask on yourself first, then put it on others in your party. And what this means here is this series of slides that we've just gone through, support your field technicians first, and then support your customers. You don't want your customers to have an edge over your field technicians, so they then wouldn't be able to use the field techs for the support that they need. So what this shows is that more and more organizations, particularly among best practices, are offering more capabilities to their customers in support of the overall organization and their field technicians as well. So whether it's at 39% or 61%, these numbers are higher than they were last year and the year before, and they're going to get higher next year for sure. There are some others being planned for development to provide to customers. And that on-site chat capability with tech support representative at 24%, I think what we'll be seeing in future surveys is going to be chatbot support as well. So everything's in flux. It's what makes market research so exciting. What you measured last year is not going to be adequate for what you need to measure this year, and it certainly won't be adequate for what you need to measure next year because things are always evolving and changing. So to put things in perspective, we wanted to take a look at what technology applications are currently being used by best practices FSOs. And no big surprises here, although I think what we'll see is that when you look at those above the 50% line, we see, 4, 8, 9 applications currently used by best practices organizations, whereas a majority of all other organizations are probably only using 4 or 5 of these categories, these technologies presently. So, for example, what best practices organizations may be using that you may not be using presently are things like time and attendance management or appointment management and a booking application. What bothered me a little bit about these numbers is that even among the best practices organizations, we see not quite half, 48%, are presently using business intelligence or analytics capabilities, and only 38% knowledge management. I think that if we only had one category, business intelligence, analytics / knowledge management, that number would certainly be above 50%. But among any service, but particularly among best practices organizations, I would like to see that number go right up into the 60s and 70%. So another thing struck me on this chart with respect to best practices organizations. 79% are currently using contract management. And when we're talking earlier about the mandate to drive increased service revenues, one way to do that is to have a very sound contract management solution in place for you, where you can have contract attachments when you sell equipment. You can have contract renewals. You can have most of that done automatically through the proper solution. And that would generate increased revenues, but also on a recurring basis, on a repeating basis, and more predictable and forecastable. So what the best practices organizations are doing that you may not be doing just yet is, for example, for all others, customer relationship management is typically the number one technology application being used. For best practices, they're saying, yeah, that's important, but you know what? Contract management is even more important because that's going to help us generate more revenues and more predictable revenues. So you don't necessarily have to be a best practices organization to benefit from some of the things that best practices organizations do. And here's one classic example of if you're not already doing something in contract or warranty management, you really need to do that. And then you'll at least be emulating some of the things that best practices organizations are doing. Now, those technology applications currently being planned for use in the next 12 months, well, we see knowledge management, 45%. So that number that we talked about in the last slide definitely is going to be going up. And other things like dynamic scheduling optimization, they might only have standard scheduling right now, and they're going to be moving up to dynamic scheduling. Remote monitoring and remote diagnostics, that's becoming more, instead of just a premium or a value add that certain organizations add to their portfolio of capabilities, it's going to become part of the core capabilities of service organizations over the next several years. Workforce management systems, appointment management, et cetera, and so forth. So what we're seeing is that best-in-class, best practices organizations currently using more technology, apps, and solutions than all others, but they're planning to use even more over the next 12 months and beyond. So where does that take them, though? What it does is it leads them to being able to measure where they've been, where they are, and where they want to go. And what we see here is above and below the 50 percentile line, 95% of best practices organizations are currently measuring customer satisfaction. That compares to only 75% among all others. So they've got something going there. In order to hit 90% customer satisfaction, you really have to measure it in detail, know where you have been, where you are now, where you're going to go if you don't make changes, and what those changes need to be. What best practices organizations also look at is not just total service costs, but they're looking at the utilization of their field technicians. They're looking at some almost ancient or traditional KPIs like first-time fix rate and mean time to repair rates, which for some organizations, I think most would be looking at first-time fix rates, but not every organization looks at a mean time to repair rate. And you might have different MTTRs for those service processes that are delivered by field technicians versus those delivered remotely. So you may have to come up with a new set of metrics, but basically what this shows is that the best practices organizations are already using more metrics than all other organizations to measure their performance. So following the lead of them, you may not be looking at enough of your metrics. You may need to add a few to your portfolio. But just measuring them doesn't do the job. You've got to do reasonably well in how your measurements turn out. So, for example, among the best practices organizations, the average customer satisfaction is 90%. It's only 83% among all others, and that took a 2-point tumble from 85% last year. So whereas the best practices organizations are still at 90 and above, what we're seeing is that if there's a gap widening, it's widening on the part of all others that are slipping a couple of points. They're not doing what they should be doing. They're not following the lead of the best practices organizations. More than 3/4 are currently attaining 77%, a majority are on average attaining 77% SLA compliance. And that's important because if you're missing your SLA obligations, there could be sanctions or penalties that could cost you, at best, just a couple of bucks a month for any SLA you're not meeting. And at worst, it could cost you customers because you can't retain customers that you can't keep satisfied. And one of the key measurements of satisfaction is SLA compliance. We see a mean average of almost 2/3, 64%, having their total service revenue under contract. Now, again, if you have your revenues under contract rather than time and materials, it becomes more predictable, more forecastable, and it's also easier to upsell and cross-sell some of your services as you move more into remote, as you start tapping more into augmented reality to support your field techs and your customers. So this is also a very key performance metric. And a 42% service profitability as a percent of service revenues. Now, the comparable figure for the total survey results, including best practices, was 38%. Excluding best practices, it bumped down to 34, almost 35%. Now, that's not a bad rate. 35% profitability is still good. But why settle for 35 or 38 when you can get 42 by aspiring to be best practices? However, even among the best practice organizations, there are some Achilles heels. More than a third are not attaining at least 80% SLA compliance. Almost a quarter not attaining at least 70% compliance. More than a quarter not achieving at least 50% of their total service revenue under contract. and just under a quarter not achieving at least 40% of the total service revenue under contract. So imagine already achieving 90% customer satisfaction and 30% profitability or greater, and still falling behind the curve here. If you can overcome these hurdles, then there's really no stopping you. There were some organizations among best practices that were making 60% service profitability, and it wasn't difficult for them because it's a stepwise procedure. It takes years to accomplish, but you've got to start somewhere. But between this chart and that chart that showed that 5% of best practices organizations still running their service operations using manual processes, they're the ones who can most benefit from new technologies and new integrations. But all organizations, whether they're manual, automated, or whatever, to whatever degree, can always benefit from improving their processes and automating as much as they can. So I'd like to close out this section by talking about how things have gotten better year over year. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. Look at this as a moving picture rather than a set of slides. When we're looking at field technician productivity, how it's improved year over year, we've got 72% that say it has improved, none that say it's declined, and that's a ratio of improved over declined by 72 to nothing. So that shows a very strong growth in field technician productivity. For service revenue per field technician, 67% improved, only 10% declined somewhat, and that's improved over decline by a ratio of nearly 7 to 1. Average cost to dispatch has also improved, although a little bit less. 41% say it's improved, 9% it's declined. That's a ratio of about 4.5 to 1. And then finally, though, service profitability appears to be on the upswing. We see 61% saying it's improved somewhat or significantly over the past 12 months. Only 7% say it's declined, and that's a ratio of improved over decline by about 9 to 1. So things are on the upswing. So what you need to do if you don't believe that you already have the right field service management solution is to do what your peers are doing. The decision to acquire, number one factor, preferring to work with a single provider of field service functionality. But there are other factors too, and if you look at the difference between the 41% and the 52%, that kind of shows a cluster there. Let's work with a single provider if we can, a solution that interfaces with our CRM solution, and that's one reason to go with a vendor like Astea, for example, which offers a CRM solution as well as its FSM solution. Preferring a solution that fosters collaboration between sales and service, and prefers a solution that's intuitive and easy to use. If you can find an FSM solution like that, and then if it rolls out quickly, then that's great. But what customers are saying here, what respondents are saying, is we don't want something simply that rolls out quickly. It's got to meet these other criteria first, then it's got to roll out quickly. So they know what they want, and they know what they wanted to interface and interact with, and then they want it to roll out quickly. So how do you aspire to best practices? Where do you start? There are basically 6 ways where we see best practices and FSOs excel. Number 1 is encouraging customer feedback. And the key thing here is the voice of the customer. The customer has a voice, and the question of if a tree falls in the forest and you're not there, does it make a sound, is irrelevant. If you're not there to hear the customer's voice, though, that is relevant because they're going to be talking. They're going to be complaining. They're going to be making suggestions for improvements. They're going to want to be interactive. So you need to conduct regularly scheduled periodic customer satisfaction surveys. 95% of the best practices organizations do. 75% of the all other organizations do. If you're not doing that, you need to do it. Whether you solicit feedback directly after a service call or whether you do an annual or twice-a-year survey, listen to the voice of the customer, but then you have to respond to the voice of the customer by personal conversations, group messages, reports, blogs, newsletters, what have you. You have to seek to delight your customers too. You need to go out of your way to delight them. And don't try to exceed your customer expectations just for the heck of it. Know what they want, and wherever it's practical, then strive to deliver to meet their expectations and exceed them. What you'll find is if you just meet 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 expectations, your customers are going to believe that you're exceeding their expectations because you're not just meeting 1 or 2 of them, you're meeting a whole cluster of them. And that shows some solidarity and, lend a compassionate ear to their main concerns. Don't just be reactive to what they have to say. Be proactive and interactive. Don't wait for them to call you. You talk to them first. See what's on their mind, what makes them tick, what ticks them off, and what you need to do about it. And if you don't do that, you won't be able to delight your customers, or you won't be able to just meet their basic requirements. You need to understand your customer's perspective, not just your perspective. What we do when we conduct customer satisfaction surveys is not just satisfaction, it's needs, requirements, preferences, and expectations, and satisfaction. So you need to understand the vertical and geographic and product markets that your customers support, and what's the value of downtime to them? What's the value of uptime to them? I think that what you'll be seeing increasingly now is customers are evolving to the point where if you understood them yesterday, but you're not talking to them today, you're not going to understand them tomorrow. Manage their expectations. Don't keep them in the dark. Don't make everything a surprise. Customers don't like surprises. Certainly they don't like negative surprises, but they don't like positive surprises. I didn't know you were going to do that. If I had known you were going to offer this new module or this new functionality, then we wouldn't have had to do this internally over the past 6 months. Why didn't you tell me? So manage customer expectations like the best practices organizations do by keeping them in the pipeline, by communicating with them, getting feedback from them, and responding to their feedback. Know how to say no. If you can do it, say yes, we'll do it for you. If you can't do it, say no, but explain why not, and try to deliver something else to them. We can't do that for you, but here's something that we can do for you that will help you along that path. So you need to know where to draw the line. Don't overpromise and then underdeliver. That would be the kiss of death for a lot of organizations. Know when to say no. Know when to say I don't know. And if you do say I don't know, tell them when you are going to know, when you're going to get back to them, and then resolve that issue. Don't let anything stay open. And maintain the human touch. Technology does not do the job. People use technology to do the job. And we're at a turning point in field service now where customers are used to dealing with their field technicians. They're used to dealing with telephone support and a customer portal support on the web. But now they're going to have to get used to dealing with chatbots. So the technology is going to take an increasing hold on the business, but you're going to need to maintain the human touch so that your customers don't feel distanced from any of the human beings that traditionally have responded to their questions and inquiries. So those were the do's. Here are the don'ts. Don't stifle customer feedback. Let them tell you what they think, even if it's negative. Don't provide average customer service. Nobody strives to be average. Nobody wants average service delivered to them. Don't treat customers all the same. They're all different. You have to treat them differently, and the only way you can do that is if you understand what the differences are. Don't stifle customer feedback. Let them talk. And that was so important. We actually put it in here twice. And don't let your customers blindside you with their expectations. They don't want to be blindsided by you. You don't want to be blindsided by them. That would suggest that ongoing communications is going to serve a great purpose. And don't say yes all the time, especially when it cannot be done. That's just going to make things worse. So there are some key takeaways here. I'm not going to go through these because we've already gone through them in detail through the course of this presentation. But, basically, what differentiates best practices organizations from all others is they are running basically as profit centers, using off-the-shelf solutions. Um, they're getting back to normal with respect to principal drivers. They're meeting their challenges, and because the opportunities are allowing them to address those challenges head on, and that even the best are not meeting all of their goals. Um, what you need to do to emulate the best practices organizations is to follow those 6 steps that we just talked about, and that should take you closer to best practices if you're not already there, and if you are there, it'll help you maintain your status there. So that's our part of the presentation. I'd like to turn the microphone over now to Emily, and she's got a few slides to show you. Okay, Emily, are you there?
Yes, I am here. All right. Thank you so much, Bill. We really appreciate you sharing that insight and all of that great data. As you see on your screen here, folks, this is Bill's information. If you have any follow-up questions for him, you want his help, he does some excellent consulting, and he is an expert in field service. So please feel free to reach out to him directly to engage with him. And as you saw, he has a lot of great data. And so part of the webcast today, we wanted to offer everyone a free copy of his analyst take report. So via email tomorrow from Astea, you'll be offered this report that you can download complimentary. Take a read. It's excellent. It goes into a lot of detail from some of the points that Bill just shared with you, and it gives a lot of great advice. And also, as a thank you for registering, if you did want to review this webcast today, or if you wanted to share it with a colleague, we'll also be sending you the recording via email tomorrow. So please keep your eye out for that as well. And now I just want to take a few minutes, and if you are not familiar with Astea, I wanted to introduce you to who we are and how we could potentially help you. So Astea International is a global leader in field service management and mobility solutions. We have been around for nearly 40 years. We'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary next year in 2019. We do have a end-to-end service lifecycle solution. We have long been known and touted by Gartner as the broadest and deepest in product functionality when it comes to field service management. And as you can see, we have a global presence with offices and customers and partners all around the world. One of our biggest updates is a new software version release that we actually just formally announced to the market this morning via press release. And some of the points that Bill was making about customer satisfaction and understanding your customers and being proactive with them and interacting with them and having a tool that is intuitive and easy to use. A lot of these philosophies are built into our new Alliance Enterprise version. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go to our website, astea.com, request a demo, learn more about it. I think you're going to like what you see. Again, this just gives you a little bit of a visual. Like I said, we're known as the broadest and deepest in terms of product functionality. So you can see these are all of the different modules that we offer with our Alliance product, including knowledge management and embedded business intelligence. We have a whole customer self-service mobile app and customer portal where you can be proactive and interact with your customers and keep them engaged in the service delivery process. And of course, all of the usual features you would need, like field service, contract and warranty management, I know, is something Bill mentioned a lot today, and a home mobility suite as well, along with the ability to really hook in your third parties and your vendors. A lot of our clients are starting to leverage contingent workers more. An example of that is being able to integrate our Alliance enterprise platform with some contingent worker portals like Work Market and Field Nation. So, like I said, if you've never seen it, now is the time to get a demo because we just released a new version. Now, with that, I'd love to pause and see if anyone has some questions. It looks like we do have a few minutes left here, not a lot, but go ahead and type any questions that you may have for either Bill or myself into the Q&A module. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I want to tell you, if you look in the handout section of your GoToWebinar screen, you will see that we have a brochure available for download for our new version. So if you want to check it out, you're free to. Oh, good. It looks like we got our first question in. And I think this is something that a lot of you will be able to relate to. Bill, this person is asking you, are most of the best practices field service organizations larger enterprises? We're a smaller company. How do you recommend that we attain a best practices standing?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think if we had conducted this webcast 5 years or 10 years ago, the answer would be you're a small company, sorry. There's not much you can do because that was at a time before the cloud basically normalized the playing field. So whether you're using an on-premise solution or more than likely a cloud-based solution presently, you now got all of the tools and opportunities and capabilities that the competitors have, that the large enterprises have, and it's a matter of not going lock, stock, and barrel, acquiring everything and trying to compete on every basis with your competitors and in an attempt to meet your customers' needs and expectations. But what you can do is you can look at where the best practices organizations are presently doing things differently than all others, differently than what you're doing, taking steps to improve your KPIs and metrics, taking steps to acquire some new technologies if you're using a solution that's 2 or 3 years old and you haven't been moving to newer releases. Well, you've got to move. You've got to take some steps because every time you fall a step behind, it requires a quicker time to bounce back to catch up. And catching up in today's world is not as easy as it was 3, 4, 6, 10 years ago. So if you're a smaller organization, make sure you have the right tools. And one of the slides that Emily had just shown about Astea's capabilities, they're the kind of capabilities that you need. And if you can embed them and integrate them into your field service management solution, into your service delivery process, then there's absolutely no reason why you still can't attain best practices. I'll go one step further. There are many smaller organizations that are not encumbered by the paperwork, the bureaucracy, the level after level of hierarchy within the organization. You're much more agile than some of the larger organizations. You can probably make some strides forward quicker than a larger enterprise can. So there's nothing stopping you. In fact, I think you've got the advantage. If you're going to spend the time and resources to acquire new technology, then you've got it made. You can take steps to really improve your standing and stature within the global services community.
Great. Thank you, Bill. We got another question in here, and I think we have just enough time to cover it. This person is asking you, how do you get people to be responsible and follow through? That is a great question and probably a challenge that a lot of you on the line are facing. Bill, what do you think about that?
Well, that's a question that we can spend another 1 hour webcast just on that. How do you get them to listen to you and to follow through? I'm assuming one of the things that is touching upon is management buy-in, and not only management, but getting all of the parties within the organization to listen to what you can accomplish with new technology, with integration of technologies, with investments in mobile tools for the field techs, et cetera, and so forth. That goes back to the charts that I showed earlier about what are the main challenges and what are the main opportunities. And I think the CFO of your organization or of your client or prospect's organization is going to be most interested in the return on investment. Your marketing people going to be more interested in is this going to improve customer satisfaction? Your operational people are going to be more interested in how can we improve the processes that we've got in place now? Do we have to trash everything and start from scratch? Can we make some improvements? What's the timeline on it? What's it going to cost? So you basically have to put together a message That's almost like the Tower of Babel. That one message is going to be understandable by your financial people, your operational people, your marketing people, and certainly by your senior management. So one place to lead off, unfortunately, this is the way the world works, is with the return on the investment. Um, you can't just present to senior management or to others within the organization. If we move ahead with something better than what we've got now, we can save some money unless you know what moving ahead is going to require. So you've got to do your homework first. The more you know about what's available out there, get your long list, move it down to a short list, watch a demo from Astea, for example, then you'll know how things work, how long it's going to take, what it's going to do, what the benefits are going to be, and then putting together a list of those benefits. Again, starting off with the financials, the rate of return, the improvements in cost reductions, the ability to generate more revenue, and from the most important things to more niche focused things like if we build a warranty and contract management program, we'll be able to generate more revenue by upselling and cross selling. It'll be more predictable. That'll reduce our costs of inventory, et cetera, and so forth. So make sure that you cross the T's and dot the I's in doing your due diligence, and then present the findings to each interested party. Each party is going to need to know everything that you found, but the CFO is going to need to see a focus on financials, et cetera, and so forth. So you've got to do your homework before you can sell this internally or externally.
Thanks, Bill. And before we close out, I just want to make one point. I think we all struggle with proving ROI, before a project, before a new technology adoption and rollout. Something that we offer as an interactive tool for our customers is an ROI calculator. If you go to our website, astea.com, right in the middle, you'll see that you can calculate your ROI on a new field service management solution, and it's powered by data from Aberdeen. So it's a third party, and we wanted to offer that because we understand that it's something a lot of people struggle with, is getting that executive management buy-in, like Bill suggested. So I really encourage you to check that out. It might be helpful for you. Well, with that, I want to say thank you so much to Bill Pollock from Strategies for Growth. It was really insightful. We really appreciate him sharing all this great survey data and advice with us today. And thank you all for spending an afternoon with me. I really appreciate it. Tomorrow we'll give you a link to download Bill's report, and then also a link to download the recording if you'd like to share it with your colleagues. Thanks again for joining, and everyone enjoy the rest of your week.